I want to tell you something before this story starts. I'm not someone who grew up with connections. I didn't have investors. I didn't have a safety net. What I had was a small apartment in New Orleans, a father who cooked like his life depended on it, and 9 years of work built on every recipe he ever taught me. And one morning, I walked into my own restaurant, opened a folder on a computer that was supposed to be mine too, and found out my business partner had filed to register my father's recipes, my dead father's recipes, as his own intellectual property. What I did about it took 9 months. It was quiet, it was calculated, and when it was done, Brendan Fisk lost everything he thought he'd taken. Stay with me on this one.
There's a smell I've been chasing my entire career. Cast iron, bay leaf, a roux that's been going for 45 minutes on low heat, right on the edge of burning but never quite getting there. Most people walk into a nice restaurant and smell money. I walk into any kitchen, a diner, a food truck, a place with a Michelin star, and I'm 9 years old again, standing on a step stool next to my father in our apartment on Dauphine Street in the 9th Ward of New Orleans. His name was Walter Calloway. He worked the overnight shift at a shipping warehouse off the port. Hard labor, long hours, the kind of work that ages a man's hands fast. He'd get home at 6 in the morning, sleep until noon, and spend the rest of the afternoon in that kitchen. Not because he had to, because it was the only place where he was completely himself. He never took a class, never watched a cooking show, never owned a cookbook. Everything he knew came from his mother, and from her mother before that. Generations of black women in Louisiana who figured out how to make something extraordinary out of what little they had. That's the thing about soul food that people outside of it don't always understand. It was never about abundance, it was about transformation. You take the cheapest cut, the toughest vegetable, the scraps nobody else wanted, and you turn it into something that makes a grown man close his eyes on the first bite. My father could do that, every single time. I used to ask him, "Dad, how do you know when the roux is ready?" He'd look at me and say, "When it smells like it's about to make a mistake, but hasn't yet." I didn't know then that sentence would define my entire life. He was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis when I was 28. I was in Montreal at the time, working in a French kitchen, learning things about precision and patience I didn't even know I needed. I got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. My sister's voice. 3 words. "Owen, come home." I drove 14 hours straight. When I walked into his apartment, he was sitting at the kitchen table. Thinner than I remembered, breathing harder. But the stove was on. There was a pot going. And when he saw me come through the door, the first thing he said wasn't "I'm sick" or "I'm scared." He said, "You're right on time. Taste this and tell me what it's missing." I sat down beside him, tasted the gumbo, said, "Filet powder, just a pinch at the very end." He pointed at me like I'd just answered the hardest question in the world. "There he is," he said. "There's my chef." I spent the next 2 years living 3 blocks from him, working at a local restaurant during the week to stay close, spending every weekend in his kitchen beside him, writing everything down. Not just the recipes, the reasoning. Why this technique and not that one? Why this order of ingredients? The logic behind every decision he'd never written down because he'd never thought he needed to. He died on a Tuesday morning in November. The stove was cold for the first time I could remember. I didn't cook professionally for 6 months after that. Not because I couldn't, because everything I knew how to make was him, and I wasn't ready to share him with strangers yet. On the 7th month, I signed a lease on a narrow shotgun building in the Garden District. 12 tables, a bar with 8 seats, a kitchen barely big enough for 3 people if you knew how to move. I named it Calloway's, not after me, after him. I had $23,000 in savings and a loan from my sister she gave me without blinking, even though she had 2 kids in school and a mortgage. I told her I'd pay it back in a year. She said, "Just make sure the gumbo is right." I didn't advertise. Couldn't afford to. We opened on a Thursday with no press, no social media, no PR plan. just the food. By Saturday night, every table was full, and there were 8 people standing outside in the New Orleans heat waiting for a seat. Word travels fast in this city when the food is real. A food blogger wrote about us 3 weeks in. She described my father's jambalaya, served exactly as he made it, not one ingredient changed, as the kind of dish that makes you wonder why you ever ate anywhere else. I read that review sitting on the floor of the kitchen after close, alone, 1 in the morning. I didn't frame it. I just sat there with it in my hands for a while. That was enough. Brendan Fisk walked into Calloway's on a Friday night 14 months after we opened. No reservation. He waited at the bar for 50 minutes without once checking his phone or showing any impatience. I noticed him because impatience is the default in this business. The waiting, the noise, the hunger, and this man just sat there like he had nowhere else in the world he needed to be. When he finally sat down, he ordered the full tasting menu without asking what was on it. I watched him eat from the kitchen past the way I always watch new customers, not to be seen, to read. You can tell everything about a person from how they eat, whether they're tasting or performing, whether the food is reaching them or just fueling them. Brendan Fisk was tasting, every bite. Eyes half closed on the first spoonful of gumbo, a real pause, fork down, after the jambalaya. When he finished, he asked to speak with the chef. I came out wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. He stood up when I approached, which people don't do and which I noticed. Extended his hand and said, "My name is Brendan Fisk. I've eaten in 43 countries, 3 Michelin star restaurants on 4 continents. And what you're doing in this kitchen is as good as anything I've had anywhere in the world." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I'd like to help you make sure more people get to experience it." I said, "I appreciate that. We're doing fine." He smiled, put a card on the table, said, "Take your time, but think about how many people will never taste this because they can't get a reservation." He left. Jerome was beside me at the pass. He looked at the card, looked at Brendan walking out and said, "I don't like him." I said, "You don't even know him." Jerome said, "I know the way he looked at the room. He wasn't looking at the restaurant. He was looking at what it could become without you in it." I put the card in my pocket. I forgot about Jerome's words for a long time. First mistake. I called Brendan 4 months later, not because I was struggling, because a pipe burst in the kitchen ceiling in February. The repair cost $11,000. My bank account looked at me like I'd personally offended it. Brendan answered on the second ring, like he'd been expecting me. We met 3 times before I agreed to anything. He brought a lawyer. I brought a lawyer. The contract was 42 pages. I read every single one. Page 18, paragraph 4. I still know it by heart. All original recipes, culinary techniques, flavor profiles, and menu concepts contributed by O&T Calloway to the partnership shall remain the exclusive intellectual property of O&T Calloway. No transfer, registration, licensing, or claim of ownership over said materials may be executed by Brendan A. Fisk or any entity affiliated with him without the prior written consent of O&T Calloway. I underlined it in red pen, showed it to my lawyer. He said, "That's as clear as it gets. You're protected." I signed on a Thursday morning in March. Brendan shook my hand and said, "This is going to be something great, Owen." I believed him. And here's what I want you to understand, because I've thought about this more than anything else when I look back at that moment. I wasn't naive. I wasn't young. I wasn't desperate. I read the contract. I had legal advice. I took 4 months to decide, and I still got betrayed, because the man who betrayed me was patient enough to wait until I stopped watching. That's the part that stays with you, not what was taken. The fact that the signs were there, and you chose not to see them. Year 3 of the partnership. Calloway's had expanded to a second location in Uptown. We had a catering operation. We were in conversations about a third location in Baton Rouge. The New York Times food section had mentioned us in a roundup of essential New Orleans dining. My father's recipes were feeding thousands of people a week. Everything I'd wanted was happening. In October, I was invited to the Charleston Food and Wine Festival. 5 days. Demonstrations, panels, a dinner I was cooking for 200 people. Brendan told me to go. Said it was the exposure that would take us national. Said he'd handle New Orleans while I was gone. Jerome was there. The team was solid. I flew to Charleston on a Sunday. Tuesday afternoon, mid-festival, my phone buzzed with a text from Louis Arsenault. Louis is 71. He's been supplying local ingredients to New Orleans restaurants for 40 years. He knew my father. Used to drop off okra at our apartment when I was a kid with no invoice, just a wave. The text said, "Owen, call me. Don't wait." I stepped off the demo stage and called him from a stairwell. He picked up and said, "I'm going to tell you something and I need you to stay calm." My stomach dropped before he said another word. Louis told me Brendan had come to his warehouse 2 days earlier. Alone. No appointment. Asked about scaling up supply, quantities, exclusivity agreements, pricing for volumes way beyond what our current locations needed, and at the end of the conversation, casual as someone asking about the weather, Brendan asked Louis if he knew any IP lawyers who specialized in culinary intellectual property registration. The stairwell got very quiet. Louis said, "Owen, I've been in this industry 40 years. I know what that question means. Somebody's about to put their name on something that doesn't belong to them." I said, "Thank you, Louis." Hung up. Stood in that stairwell for 3 minutes without moving. Around me I could hear the festival. Applause, laughter, glasses clinking, someone talking about the transformative power of local ingredients. I thought about my father at that stove on Dauphine Street. I thought about the 2 years I spent beside him writing every recipe down. I thought about page 18, paragraph 4, of a contract I'd signed with a man I trusted. And then I remembered something my father told me once. In the kitchen, late at night when I was maybe 12 years old. He said, "Owen, the most dangerous person in the world isn't the one who lies to your face. It's the one who waits until you trust them completely, and then moves while you're looking the other way." I booked a flight home for the next morning. Didn't tell Brendan I was coming. I got to Calloway's at 6:47 in the morning, before the kitchen staff, before Jerome, before anyone. Went in through the back, straight to the office we shared at the rear of the building, opened the laptop on the desk, the administrative computer we both had access to, that I'd never once thought to check in 3 years of partnership because I trusted him. There was a folder on the desktop I'd never seen before, named IP Portfolio, Culinary Holdings LLC. I double-clicked it, 12 files, all dated within the last 6 weeks. Opened the first one, USPTO application, the United States Patent and Trademark Office, filed 3 weeks ago. Applicant, Brendan A. Fisk, listed under original culinary works and proprietary recipes. What followed was a list of 11 dishes, with the exact names my father had given them. The names I'd told Brendan over dinners, over drinks, over 3 years of building something together while I thought we were partners. His Ninth Ward Gumbo, listed as Fisk's New Orleans-style gumbo, original creation. His cast-iron jambalaya, listed as Fisk's Heritage Jambalaya, proprietary recipe. His pork crackling cornbread, listed as Fisk's Southern Cornbread, original formulation. My father's name was nowhere on any of it. I closed the laptop, walked out of the office, through the kitchen, past the stove that was cold and quiet at that hour. Stopped at the wall where I kept my father's photograph, the one I'd hung on the first day we opened. Walter Calloway, standing in his kitchen on Dauphine Street, wooden spoon in his hand, looking directly at the camera with that expression he always had. Not proud exactly, more like certain, like a man who knew exactly who he was. I took the photo down, held it, and made a decision, quiet, cold, and absolute. Brendan Fisk was going to learn something my father taught me a long time ago in a small kitchen on Dauphine Street. You can steal a recipe, but you cannot steal the hands that made it. Let me tell you something about rage. Real rage, the kind that comes from a deep betrayal, not a minor inconvenience. Doesn't feel like fire. Not at first, it feels like ice. When I walked out of that office with my father's photograph in my hands, I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I wasn't thinking about calling Brendan and losing it on the phone. What I felt was something I'd only experienced once before, standing in my father's apartment the morning after he died, looking at his cold stove. A kind of absolute clarity that only comes when something that cannot be replaced has been taken from you. I knew two things with total certainty. One, if I confronted Brendan right now, I'd lose. He had lawyers, he had resources, he had a 3-week head start on a legal process I didn't fully understand yet. And the moment he knew I'd found those files, he'd move fast. 2, I needed to know everything before I moved a single piece on this board. I put my father's photo in my bag, walked out the back door, got in my car, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes thinking through my next move. Then I drove to Jerome's house and knocked on his door at 7 in the morning. He opened it in a t-shirt and sweatpants, took one look at my face and said, "I told you." I said, "I know. Can I come in?" He stepped aside without another word. Jerome Tate has been in professional kitchens since he was 17. He's 52 now. Worked for 3 James Beard nominees, survived 2 restaurant closures that weren't his fault, raised 2 daughters on his own. He's the most honest person I've ever worked with. And he has a radar for dishonest people that I've never fully understood but have learned to never ignore. I sat at his kitchen table and told him everything. The contract, the partnership, the folder, the USPTO filing. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long has that folder been there?" I said, 6 weeks based on the file dates. He nodded slowly. Then said, "Oh, and I need to tell you something I should have told you 2 months ago." My stomach tightened. He told me that in August, 8 weeks earlier, he'd arrived at the restaurant early and found Brendan in the office, alone, laptop open. Jerome had assumed it was normal, but Brendan closed the laptop faster than necessary when Jerome walked in. And when Jerome asked what he was doing, Brendan said he was reviewing vendor contracts. Jerome said, "I didn't think much of it at the time, but the way he closed that laptop, it was too fast, like someone who wasn't doing what they said they were doing." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at me straight. "Because you trusted him, and every time I said something about that man, you defended him. I didn't want to damage something you'd built on a feeling I couldn't prove." I had nothing to say to that, because he was right. Every single time Jerome had expressed unease about Brendan, a sideways comment, a look, a hesitation, I'd smoothed it over. Because the partnership was working, because the business was growing, because trusting Brendan was easier than questioning him. That's what betrayal really cost you. Not just the thing that was taken, the realization that the warning signs were there, and you chose not to see them. Jerome said, "So, what do we do?" I said, "You don't do anything yet. I do. And I need you to act completely normal at work. Can you do that?" He said, "I've been acting normal around that man for 3 years. Few more weeks won't kill me." I found Renata Souza through a food industry attorney in Baton Rouge who told me she was the best IP lawyer in Louisiana for cases involving culinary intellectual property. Her office was on Magazine Street, 3rd floor of a building that smelled like old coffee and legal briefs. She was 44, sharp as anyone I've ever met, and had a way of listening that made you feel she was simultaneously taking in every word and already 3 steps ahead of what you were about to say. I told her everything: the contract, the partnership, the folder, the filing. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you have documentation of when those recipes were created? Anything dated, notebooks, emails, photos, anything that establishes a timeline predating your partnership with Fisk?" I said, "My father created those recipes over 40 years. I have notebooks from when I was documenting them before he died, photographs of us cooking together, recipe cards he wrote by hand that I kept." She leaned forward. "Are any of those cards dated in his handwriting?" I thought about it. Some of them. He dated things the way old men do, Not systematically, but occasionally. There are cards with years written in the corner. She said, "Good. Now, this is critical. The USPTO application Fisk filed is a registration attempt, not a granted patent. It takes time to process. If we move correctly, we can file a challenge that stops it before it's ever approved. But we have to move before it clears." I said, "How long do we have?" She said, 60 to 90 days. Maybe less if they expedited. 60 to 90 days. While I still had to walk into work every morning and look Brendan Fisk in the eye. She said, "I know that's hard, but here's what I need you to understand. If you confront him now, he gets to react. If you wait and build the case correctly, you control every variable of what happens next. Do you understand the difference?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Go back to work. Smile, cook, and bring me everything your father ever wrote." That weekend I went to my sister Diane's house. She'd kept a storage box of my father's things after he passed. Items that didn't fit in my apartment but that neither of us could throw away. I hadn't opened that box in 4 years. She sat with me at the kitchen table while I went through it. Didn't ask why. Just made coffee and stayed close. There were dish towels, a worn apron, 2 cast iron skillets I took home immediately. And underneath all of it, a bundle of index cards held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. My father's recipe cards, 41 cards, some barely legible, written in his cramped left-handed script, some with grease stains on the corners from years of handling over a hot stove, some with dates, not all, but some. The earliest dated one read, September 1987, the latest, March 2019. 8 months before he died. I sat at my sister's kitchen table and read every single one. Diane didn't say anything for a long time. Then quietly, "He wrote those for you, you know. He never wrote anything down his whole life. Started doing it when you told him you wanted to be a chef. Said he wanted to make sure you had something to take with you." I couldn't speak for a moment. Then I said, "Someone tried to take them from me." She looked at me. I told her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "Owen, Daddy always said the proof of a dish isn't in the recipe. It's in the hands that made it and the story behind it. No document Brendan Fisk files is going to change where those recipes came from. You just have to make sure the world knows the story." I packed the recipe cards into a folder, drove them to Renata's office the next morning. She looked at them for a long time, then looked up at me and said, "These are extraordinary. This is your case." Monday morning, I walked into Calloway's at 9 o'clock like nothing had happened. Brendan was already there, sitting at the bar, coffee in hand, reviewing something on his tablet. Looked up when I came in and smiled the way he always smiled. Easy, warm, the smile of a man who had never once felt like he was doing anything wrong. "Owen, how was Charleston?" "Great. Good response to the demo. Met some people from Food and Wine magazine. Excellent, exactly the kind of exposure we need." He asked about the festival. I told him about it. We talked about the Baton Rouge expansion timeline. He showed me some contractor quotes. Normal, easy, completely, perfectly normal. And the whole time, underneath every word, I was thinking, you sat in that office and put my father's name on your documents. You are smiling at me right now, and you have no idea that I know. When he left that afternoon, Jerome appeared beside me at the kitchen pass and said quietly, without looking at me, "How you doing?" I said, "Fine." He said, "You sure? Because you've been gripping that dish towel for 20 minutes and it's completely dry." I looked down at my hands. He was right. I set the towel down. "I'm fine," I said. "I'm exactly where I need to be." 3 weeks into the silent investigation, Louis Arsenault called me. He'd been doing his own digging, not because I asked him to, but because Louis has been in this industry 40 years and doesn't tolerate dishonesty in any form, and because he loved my father. He told me he'd spoken to 2 other restaurant suppliers in the city. Both had been visited by Brendan in the past 2 months, asking about supply agreements for a new culinary concept he was developing, independently of Calloway's, a new culinary concept. Louis said, "He's been building something parallel, Owen, while running your business with your money and your recipes, building his own thing on the side." I gripped the phone. Louis said, "There's more. One of the suppliers, a guy named Pete Broussard over on Chupatula's, said Brendan showed him a menu mock-up, as a preview, to lock in a supply agreement. And," long pause, "it was your father's dishes, Owen, rebranded, different names, but the same dishes. Pete recognized the jambalaya description because I'd told him about your restaurant. He called me. I called you. I sat down on the curb outside the restaurant. Right there on the street, in the middle of the day, I just sat down on the curb because my legs decided they didn't want to hold me up anymore. Brendan wasn't just trying to steal the recipes. He was planning to open a competing restaurant, built entirely on my father's life's work, and leave me with nothing. 9 years, my father's legacy, my sister's loan, Jerome's loyalty. All of it was just a stepping stone for a man who'd walked into my restaurant without a reservation and decided somewhere between the gumbo and the cornbread that he wanted what I had. I called Renata from that curb. She picked up, and before she could say anything, I said, "He's building a competing restaurant. Same dishes." Pause. Then she said very calmly, "Owen, don't move. My office. 1 hour." We just went from a strong case to an airtight one. I was in Renata's office at 3 o'clock. Laptop open, legal pad covered in notes. She looked up when I walked in and said, "Sit down. I have something to show you." She turned the laptop toward me. Business registration document, filed with the Louisiana Secretary of State's office. 11 days ago. Business name, Fisk's Southern Table, LLC. Listed principal, Brendan A. Fisk. Address, a commercial space on Magazine Street, 4 blocks from my restaurant. And at the bottom of the document under business description, full-service restaurant specializing in authentic New Orleans soul food and Creole cuisine based on original proprietary recipes. I stared at that screen for a long time. Then I looked at Renata. She said, "He's already signed the lease. Construction starts in 3 weeks. I said, "How do we stop it?" She smiled, not a warm smile, the kind that belongs to someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment. She said, "We don't just stop it, Owen. We dismantle it, piece by piece, in public, in a way he will never recover from." "And the recipes? My father's name?" She closed the laptop, looked at me straight. "By the time we're done, no one in this industry will ever associate those dishes with anyone but Walter Calloway. I promise you that." I leaned back in the chair, and for the first time since I'd opened that folder at 6:47 in the morning in my own restaurant, I felt something shift. Not relief. Not yet. But the first breath of something that was starting to feel like it. Renata gave me 1 week. Not to act. To document. She said, "Owen, the difference between winning and losing a case like this isn't who's right. It's who has paper. You're right. Now we need to turn that into paper." She gave me a list. 6 items. 1. Photograph and digitize every one of my father's handwritten recipes with the dates visible and have the file notarized. 2. Pull every email between me and Brendan, especially any message where I described the dishes, told the story behind them, or referenced my father as their creator. 3. Locate the original blog post that covered Calloway's in the early months, the one that described the recipes as my father's legacy, and capture the full archived version with publication date. 4. Get a written statement from Louis Arsenault describing Brendan's visit to the warehouse and the question about IP lawyers. 5. Find out if there were other suppliers or contacts Brendan had approached about the new project. 6. Keep showing up to work every day like nothing had happened. That 6th item was the hardest. Looking at Brendan Fisk every single day, talking expansion timelines, discussing sales numbers, and not letting one word slip of what I knew. That took a kind of discipline I didn't know I had. Jerome helped. Every morning before service, he'd pass by me in the kitchen and say quietly, One more day. That was enough. I spent 3 nights straight going through 3 years of emails. I remember sitting down at my desk on Wednesday night at 11, opening the first page of the correspondence history with Brendan Fisk, thinking it was going to be tedious work. It wasn't. It was like reading the manual for how I'd been played. Because Brendan was smart. In the early months, he'd ask me about the dishes in ways that looked like genuine curiosity. "Owen, tell me more about that version of the gumbo. What makes it different?" And I'd answer, in detail, with the history, with the specific techniques, with the names my father had given each variation. Every one of those emails was a dated record of me describing my father's recipes as his legacy, months, in some cases years, before Brendan tried to register them as his own. I copied every relevant email into a separate folder. When I finished, Friday, 2 in the morning, I had 63 emails that built an airtight timeline. Sent everything to Renata. She responded at 7 the next morning with one line. "Owen, he didn't leave a door open. He left every door open. I'll start preparing the filing tomorrow." Louis Arsenault gave me the written statement without hesitating. 2 pages, handwritten in the large, deliberate script of a man who wants every word read clearly. He described Brendan's visit, the question about IP lawyers, the casual tone that clearly wasn't casual. Signed it, dated it, had it notarized. When he handed me the envelope, he said, "Your father was a good man, Owen. Good men deserve people around them who stay loyal." I couldn't respond, just shook his hand. Pete Broussard was different. Pete supplies seafood and local meats. 58 years old, heavy voice, the kind of man who negotiates face-to-face and doesn't like lawyers or complications. When I called him, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Knew this was going to come back to me." I met Pete at his warehouse on a Tuesday morning. He showed me what Brendan had presented, a printed menu mock-up he'd left as part of the supply pitch. When I held that paper in my hands and saw the dish names, slightly altered, but clearly derived, clearly recognizable to anyone who knew Calloway's, something happened in my chest that I can't describe precisely. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. It was seeing physical proof that someone had looked at what my father built over decades and decided he could just take it. Pete said, "You need me to sign something?" I said, "Just a statement describing what he showed you. Date, what he said, what was on the paper." Pete said, "Hand me a pen." The blog post that had covered Calloway's in the early months was still online. A local food site called Plate and Place. The writer's name was Sandra Way, and she'd written a full-page profile on the restaurant 18 months before Brendan ever walked through the door. The title, "The Son, the Father, and the Recipe Nobody Else Could Make." The article described the dishes in detail, referenced my father's history, stated clearly that the entire menu was built around Walter Calloway's recipes. There was a photo of me in the kitchen next to the framed photograph of my father on the wall. Publication date, March 2021. Brendan's USPTO filing, September 2024. 3.5 years of public documentation, indexed by Google, showing those dishes existed and were publicly attributed to my father, long before Brendan Fisk put his name on anything. When I sent Renata the link, she replied, "You just solved half my case." 3 weeks into the silent investigation, something almost came apart. Thursday, late afternoon. The restaurant had closed lunch service and the team was on break before dinner. Brendan had stayed back to review documents in the office, which was normal. I was in the kitchen testing a new preparation when Jerome came toward me fast and said low, "He's on the computer. Looks like he's deleting something." I went to the office doorway. Open door. Brendan had his back to me, typing. I made a decision in under 2 seconds. I couldn't let him delete whatever he was deleting. But I couldn't show that I knew what he was doing. I walked in and said, in the most casual voice I've ever used in my life, "Brendan, you seen where the Broussard vendor contract folder ended up? Need to check a delivery clause." He closed the tab that was open, but not before I caught the screen for a fraction of a second. IP portfolio folder. He turned to me with the usual smile. Haven't seen it, but it should be in the physical file in the second drawer. Right, thanks. I walked out, went straight to the bathroom, closed the door, stood in front of the mirror for 30 seconds, just breathing. That night I texted Renata. He may be deleting files, we need to move faster. She replied in 2 minutes. Filing goes tomorrow, it's already done. The next morning Renata filed 3 documents simultaneously. First, an opposition to trademark registration with the USPTO, formally challenging Brendan's application before it could be approved, with all the origin documentation attached, the dated recipe cards, the 63 emails, the 2021 article, the statements from Lewis and Pete. Second, a formal notice of contract breach sent directly to Brendan Fisk and his attorney, citing specifically paragraph 4 of page 18 of the partnership agreement, the paragraph I'd underlined in red. Third, an emergency injunction request to block the opening of Fisk's Southern Table while the case was in dispute, based on unfair competition and unauthorized use of intellectual property. Brendan received all of it within 40 minutes. I knew he'd received it because for the first time in 3 weeks of silent partnership, my phone rang with his number at 10 on a Friday morning. I didn't answer. He called 4 times, sent 3 texts. First one said, "Owen, we need to talk." Second one said, "This is a misunderstanding, call me." Third one said, "Owen, I can explain all of this." I forwarded all 3 to Renata without responding to any of them. She said, "Perfect. Don't respond directly. All communication goes through me now." 2 days later, Brendan's attorney contacted Renata asking for a meeting. Renata called me and said, "They want to negotiate." I said, "No." She said, "Owen, listen to me. A meeting isn't weakness. It's intelligence. You're going to sit in that room and see exactly what they have. Or better yet, what they don't have. Then you'll know whether we can resolve this fast or whether it goes to discovery, which is going to be long and expensive for both sides." Pause. But more importantly, when Brendan Fisk sees you walk into that room with all of this documentation, he's going to realize for the first time that you're not the man he thought he was manipulating. I went. The meeting was in a conference room at Brendan's attorney's office in a glass tower in the CBD. Long table, expensive chairs, water in glass bottles. The kind of room designed to make you feel small. Brendan was already seated when I walked in. Next to him, his attorney, a man in his 60s with gold-rimmed glasses who had the energy of someone used to getting his way in rooms like this. Brendan looked up when I entered. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't smile. I sat down, put my folder on the table. Renata sat beside me. Brendan's attorney started talking about contractual misunderstandings and intentions that had been miscommunicated, and I listened to every word without letting my expression move. When he finished, Renata opened the folder and placed the documents on the table, one by one, slowly, in silence. My father's dated recipe cards, the 63 emails, the 2021 article, Louis and Pete's statements, and last, the copy of Brendan's USPTO filing side by side with the partnership contract, paragraph 4 circled in red. Brendan's attorney looked at the documents for a long time. Brendan didn't look at the documents once. He looked at me, and I saw something in that look he'd never shown before. He knew he'd picked the wrong man. The attorney said, more carefully now, "What exactly is your client seeking as a resolution?" Renata said, "Full and immediate withdrawal of all USPTO registration filings, dissolution of Fisk's Southern Table LLC, partnership rescission with compensation, and a formal written acknowledgement that the recipes in question are the exclusive original work of Walter Calloway and Owen Calloway." The attorney started to say something about excessive terms, and Renata simply said, "You've seen the documentation. Take it to your client. I need a response in 72 hours, and because next week I file the full complaint and the New York Times food desk gets a copy of the record." Silence. Brendan looked down. I picked up my folder, stood up, and walked out of that room without saying a single word. There was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be said was already on that table. Renata got the response from Brendan's attorney 48 hours later, not 72. She called me at 7 in the morning and said, "They want to negotiate terms. They're willing to accept most of the conditions." I said, "Most?" She said, "They're asking that the formal acknowledgement of your father be kept private, not public." I was quiet for a moment, then I said, "Renata, my father spent 40 years in a small kitchen in a Ninth Ward apartment. Never got credit for anything he made. Never had his name in a food review, an article, an award. Never asked for it, but now that someone tried to steal the only legacy he left behind, the acknowledgement can't be private. It has to be public. It has to be permanent. It has to be the first thing anyone sees when they search the name of those dishes." Long pause. Renata said, "Then that's what we're going to get." "How?" "The best way possible," she said. "In the place where everyone will see it." Route 22, The Stolen Table. Verso Inglés Norte Americano. Party 4. Final Scene 20. What Renata had in mind. When Renata said, "in the place where everyone will see it," I assumed she meant a press release, maybe a legal notice in the local paper. The kind of thing attorneys do to create public record. That wasn't it. She laid out the plan on a Monday morning, sitting in the same Magazine Street office where everything had started 6 weeks earlier. She said, "Owen, you have something Brendan Fisk will never have. You have the story, the real story, the father, the apartment in the Ninth Ward, the handwritten recipes, the 2 decades of love that are in every dish you serve. That's not just legal evidence, that's the kind of story people need to hear." I said, "What are you proposing?" She said, "Sandra Way, the writer who published the 2021 piece about Calloway's." I said, "What about her?" "She's not a blogger anymore. She's the food editor at the New Orleans Advocate, and she called me last week after seeing our opposition filing in the USPTO public record. Filings are public, Owen, anyone can pull them. She wants to write the story." I didn't say anything. Renata continued. "The story of the chef who discovered his business partner tried to steal his dead father's recipes, with all the documentation, in your words, published before any legal resolution is announced, which means by the time the settlement closes, the public narrative is already set. Your father's name will be in every article that covers the outcome." I said, "What if Brendan pushes back, goes after the paper?" She said, "Welcome to it. The documentation we have makes any action he takes against the truth an exercise in public self-destruction. His attorney knows that. It's why they want to negotiate instead of litigate." Pause. "Owen, you want your father's name protected legally? The settlement does that. But you want the world to know who Walter Calloway was? Only the story does that." I thought about my father. The apartment on Dauphine Street. The smell of roux at 6 in the morning. The way he'd say, when it smells like it's about to make a mistake but hasn't yet. I said, "Set up the interview." Sandra Way interviewed me for 3 hours on a Wednesday afternoon in the Calloway's kitchen after lunch service closed. I cooked while we talked. Not for show, because that's how I process things. I need my hands busy when I'm talking about something that matters. She asked me questions no journalist had ever asked before. Not about the restaurant, not about the numbers, not about the expansion, about my father, about what it was like growing up in that kitchen, about what I felt when he died, about what it meant to open Calloway's with his name on the door. At one point she said, "Tell me about the first time you served his gumbo to a customer." I stopped stirring what was on the stove. Said, "It was a Thursday, 2 weeks after we opened. A woman came in alone, sat at a table in the back, ordered the gumbo. I watched her from the kitchen window the way I always watch new customers. When she took the first spoonful, she closed her eyes, kept them closed for about 10 seconds. When she opened them, there were tears. She didn't know I was watching. What did you feel?" I thought about it for a second. That my father was in that dining room. Sandra stopped writing. After a moment, she said quietly, "That's the first paragraph." The article published on a Friday morning. Title, Someone tried to steal a dead man's recipes. His son had been keeping receipts. Subheadline: How Owen Calloway spent 9 months building an airtight case to protect his father's culinary legacy, and what he found when he started looking. I read it sitting at my kitchen table at 6 a.m. before anything else. Sandra had captured everything: my father's story, the Ninth Ward apartment, the handwritten recipes, Brendan's betrayal, the documentation, the conference room meeting. And in the center of the article, a photograph I'd brought at Sandra's request. My father in the kitchen on Dauphine Street, back to the camera, stirring a pot, morning light coming through the small window. The caption read, Walter Calloway, New Orleans, circa 2014. His recipes fed thousands he never knew. In the first 2 hours, the article had 4,000 shares. In the first 6 hours, it had been picked up by national food outlets. Eater National ran a summary. Food and Wine tweeted the link with the comment, "This is the kind of story the food industry needs to reckon with." By 2 p.m, Renata's phone wasn't stopping. By 3 p.m, Brendan's attorney called hers with a direct message. My client accepts all terms. All of them, including the public acknowledgement. When Renata called to tell me I was in the kitchen prepping for dinner service, I leaned back against the stainless steel wall, closed my eyes for a second and just breathed. Didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did she. Sometimes that's enough. The final document was signed on a Monday morning. Brendan Fisk withdrew all USPTO registration filings. Fisk's Southern Table LLC was dissolved. The Magazine Street lease canceled with penalty. The Calloway's partnership was rescinded with compensation that covered legal costs and a full year of independent operation. And in Item 6 of the settlement, the item Renata had insisted on, and that Brendan's attorney had tried to remove 3 times before giving up, there was a paragraph I've read more times than I can count. Brendan A. Fisk formally and publicly acknowledges that all recipes, culinary techniques, and menu concepts attributed to Calloway's restaurant were originally created by Walter Calloway, deceased, and developed and refined by Owen T. Calloway. No intellectual property rights over these materials belong or have ever belonged to Brendan A. Fisk at any time. This acknowledgement shall be filed as public record and may be cited by Owen T. Calloway in any commercial, editorial, or legal context. Brendan signed that paragraph without looking at me. I watched him sign it. I didn't feel triumph, didn't feel satisfied anger. What I felt was something much simpler and much deeper than either of those things. I felt like I'd done what needed to be done. My father had his name back, and no one was ever going to take it again. I'll tell you what happened after, not because the outcome is the most important part of this story, but because you need to know that the things that seem impossible to recover, sometimes you recover them completely. Calloway's today has 3 locations, the original in the Garden District, the second in Uptown that was already there, and a third we opened in March, not in Baton Rouge the way I'd planned with Brendan, but in Houston, Texas, largest city in the South, largest African-American community in the region. Jerome is a co-owner now. When I told him I wanted him to have equity in the business, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know, I want to." He said, "All right then," and went back to the kitchen. That's Jerome. 40 words where most people would use 400, and every one of them worth more than 1,000. Louis Arsenault is the official supplier for all 3 locations. When he signed the contract, he folded the paper, put it in his apron pocket, and said, "Your father would be satisfied." Nothing else. Didn't need to say anything else. Renata Souza has a permanent reserved table at Calloway's. She's never needed to pay for a meal since. When I mentioned it, she said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know, I want to." She laughed. First time I'd ever heard her actually laugh. As for Brendan Fisk, Sandra's article stayed online and kept getting referenced. When restaurant investors search his name today, it's one of the first things they find. 2 of the 3 restaurants he had in other states closed in the year following the story. The local operators terminated their agreements citing reputational risk. The third is still open but running well below where it was before. He never contacted me after the settlement signing. I don't expect that to change. And honestly, I don't think about Brendan Fisk much anymore, because what I walked away with from all of this has nothing to do with him. There's one thing I want you to take from this story, not the revenge, not the settlement, not the 3 restaurants, it's this. When my father was dying, I used to spend weekends in his kitchen writing recipes in a notebook, and sometimes in the middle of an explanation, he'd stop and stare at the pot for a while without saying anything. I'd ask him, "What is it, Dad?" And he'd say, "Just thinking." "About what?" And he'd answer, always some version of, about how long it took to get it right. He wasn't talking about the roux. He was talking about his whole life. Everything he'd learned and refined and passed down without ever once getting credit for any of it. 40 years of love distilled in a small kitchen where nobody outside the family ever came. What Brendan Fisk didn't understand, what people like him never understand, is that you can't register a story. You can't patent the time a person put into something. You can put your name on documents. You can build walls around words written on paper. But you cannot take what is in the hands of the person who made it. You cannot take what is in the memory of the person who stood in that kitchen. You cannot take what is in the eyes of a woman who closes them on the first spoonful of a gumbo on a Thursday night, and doesn't know that the man who created it will never know she did that. My father built something extraordinary in a place where nobody was paying attention. My job was always to make sure people paid attention. Brendan Fisk taught me that sometimes you have to fight to do that. And it's worth fighting for. Whatever is yours, it's always worth fighting for.